In the spring of 1848, smoke rose above the May River, black and slow, twisting through the moss-draped oaks of South Carolina's low country. By dawn, the locals of Beaufort gathered along the road that led to the Rutledge estate, Fairhaven, once the grandest house in the district. All that remained now were stone chimneys and the stench of something far worse than fire. The county coroner's report, the one that survived only in rumor, claimed the bodies of Judge Cornelius Rutledge and his 5 adult sons were found intact but mutilated beyond comprehension. Every man had been castrated, each wound cut with surgical precision, each left alive long enough to suffer. The newspaper, however, printed a different story, a simple accidental fire, tragic but unremarkable. Within days, all official documents vanished from the courthouse, but people talked. They whispered about the missing slave, the man called Isaac who had disappeared that same night, leaving no trace except for a small leather-bound book later discovered in a courthouse basement nearly 70 years later. The pages, written in neat, deliberate script, didn't describe a murder. They revealed a pattern, a decade of medical experiments, mutilations, and complicity reaching deep into Beaufort's most respected families. What drove an enslaved man, educated yet bound by chains, to commit such a precise, unthinkable act? What secret had been buried so deeply that even abolitionists, once the story reached the North, refused to repeat it? Before we continue with the story of Isaac and the Rutledge family, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because stories like this, buried in courthouse basements and family attics, don't tell themselves. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far these dark American secrets can travel. The truth about that spring night didn't die in the ashes of Fairhaven. It lived in silence, in the looks exchanged by old families when the Rutledge name was mentioned, in the locked drawers of plantation homes, and in the lingering shame of those who'd watched and said nothing. What happened at Fairhaven wasn't just a murder. It was the eruption of a truth that had festered for years, a truth that turned a man into a weapon and a community into accomplices. Because the real story of that night didn't begin with fire. It began with numbers, with ledgers, and with a man who understood that numbers don't lie. People do. For 70 years, no one in Beaufort County spoke the name Rutledge aloud. Families who had once dined at Fairhaven began striking the name from their family Bibles, as if erasing it from ink could erase it from blood. The ruins of the estate were left untouched, the land slowly reclaimed by kudzu and moss. Only the stone steps remained, leading up to nothing. Children in the 1890s were warned not to wander near the property. "Bad spirits walk there," their elders whispered. But the older generation knew it wasn't spirits they feared. It was memory. Because everyone in Beaufort in 1848 had known something about what went on behind the judge's closed doors. To outsiders, Judge Cornelius Rutledge was a pillar of law and refinement, a man of wealth, education, and mercy when it suited him. But within Beaufort's inner circles, the plantation elite who gathered at the Charleston Club each spring, whispers persisted about the judge's private experiments, the kind of medical progress that even other slaveholders considered obscene. The official story of the fire appeared in the Charleston Courier 2 weeks after the event. It described a lightning strike, a night of high winds, and the tragic loss of 6 men who had devoted their lives to justice, agriculture, and the prosperity of the South. No mention was made of the missing slave. No mention of the blood found in the study, the instruments discovered half melted in the ash, or the fact that the bodies were found intact, untouched by flame. When the sheriff's deputy, a man named Samuel Keating, tried to file a full report, the county clerk quietly removed it from the record. Within a month, Keating had resigned and left South Carolina altogether. The Rutledge fortune was quietly divided among distant cousins, and Fairhaven's land was parceled off. But the story refused to die completely. In the 1920s, when construction began on a new courthouse in Beaufort, workers unearthed a small leather book wedged behind a crumbling section of brick. Inside were 31 pages, each written in the same hand. The handwriting was elegant but deliberate, the kind of script taught to the educated in the early 19th century. Across the first page, written in faded ink, were 4 words: "This is their truth." The journal contained dates, names, and numbers. an accountant's record of horrors committed under the guise of science and progress. It spoke of experiments on enslaved women, of procedures that left them broken or dead. Each entry ended with the same signature: Isaac. Local officials locked the journal away. It was too dangerous to display, too disturbing to publish. For a time, even historians dismissed it as a forgery, until they compared the handwriting with surviving plantation ledgers signed by Judge Rutledge himself, the same ink, the same paper, the same hands that recorded cotton yields had recorded crimes. And buried, somewhere between those pages, was the beginning of Isaac's revenge. In 1848, Fairhaven stood like a monument to Southern confidence. 3 stories of whitewashed brick rising from the banks of the May River, its wide veranda framed by columns imported from Savannah, its windows catching the evening light like sheets of polished gold. The locals called it the Judge's Citadel. To those who lived inside its walls, it was something else entirely, a place where mercy ended at the front door. The estate stretched across 800 acres of Sea Island cotton fields, dotted with slave cabins, a sawmill, and a private dock where steamboats delivered goods from Charleston every fortnight. The fields shimmered silver-green in the morning mist. From a distance it looked peaceful. But peace in the Low Country had always been bought with screams. The Judge's father had built Fairhaven after the War of 1812, and the family's power grew with every generation. By the 1840s, the Rutledge name carried the kind of weight that made sheriffs hesitate, merchants bow, and priests hold their tongues. Within that house, law and sin were often the same thing, both written by the same hand. The front hall displayed portraits of ancestors in powdered wigs and crimson robes. Their eyes followed visitors, painted with the arrogance of men who believed themselves gods of their own soil. The marble floors had been shipped from Italy, the chandelier from France. But the real heart of the house was the study, a paneled room of dark mahogany, smelling of tobacco, whiskey, and something faintly metallic. It was here that Judge Rutledge held his Thursday consultations. And it was here that the most unspeakable acts took place. The judge's reputation as a man of learning masked something far more sinister. He'd trained briefly in medicine at the University of Pennsylvania before turning to law, and he never abandoned his fascination with the human body. On Fairhaven, that curiosity found its victims among the enslaved. Women taken from the quarters under the pretext of treatment, returned days later, pale and silent, or not returned at all. Those who survived said nothing. The penalty for speaking was worse than death. By 1848, the estate housed over 200 enslaved men, women, and children. They worked the cotton fields from dawn to dusk, their lives governed by the overseer's whip and the rhythm of the harvest. Yet even among them a hierarchy existed. The house slaves viewed Isaac, the plantation's bookkeeper, with a mixture of envy and suspicion. He was the only one who could walk into the study without being summoned, the only one who touched the judge's ledgers, the only one who understood the secrets written between those lines. At night, when the house fell silent and the air hung heavy with the scent of magnolia and sweat, Isaac would light a single candle in his small room above the kitchen. Through his thin window, he could see the reflection of the study's lamp glowing through the oaks, a reminder that knowledge, in this place, was both a gift and a curse. Fairhaven looked like prosperity, but underneath its white facade lay rot, patient and waiting. At the center of Fairhaven's power stood Judge Cornelius Rutledge, a man whose name inspired both reverence and quiet dread. Born into wealth, educated in Charleston, he carried himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who believed Providence itself had written his authority into law. In his 6th decade, his hair had turned silver, his back remained straight, and his eyes, pale, gray, and cold, seemed to look through men rather than at them. He was not merely a judge of the circuit court. He was the law embodied. His rulings shaped Beaufort County's understanding of justice, and justice under his hand rarely favored mercy. His reputation for firmness in slave trials was legend. When a slave stole a loaf of bread, he ordered 30 lashes. When one struck an overseer, he ordered hanging. But when white men committed worse crimes, he preferred discretion. To outsiders, his harshness was discipline. To those who lived under him, it was cruelty wrapped in scripture. His 5 sons mirrored their father's authority, each molded by privilege, entitlement, and inherited brutality. Cornelius Jr., the eldest, was the mirror image of his father in both build and temperament. At 41, unmarried and humorless, he oversaw the daily operations of the plantation with a ledger in one hand and a writing crop in the other. The enslaved called him Little Judge, not for his size, but for the way he mimicked his father's tone when delivering punishment. He was efficient, methodical, and utterly without empathy. Thomas, the second son at 38, had a gentler voice but a colder imagination. He had studied medicine briefly in Charleston and shared his father's fascination with biological improvement. He called it progress. Others called it horror. Every Thursday, he rode 7 miles from his own plantation on St. Helena Island to attend the consultations at Fairhaven. William, at 35, was the lawyer, the family's connection to Charleston's courts and backroom deals. He was the kind of man who could make the unlawful seem legal with a well-placed clause. It was William who ensured that Fairhaven's medical purchases, scalpels, chemicals, chloroform, were marked in the ledgers as educational equipment. Then came the twins, Robert and James, both 28. They had inherited none of their father's discipline and all of his arrogance. Handsome, reckless, and violent, they treated the enslaved quarters as their hunting ground. What their older brothers performed in secret experiments, they enacted in drunken cruelty. To them, suffering was a kind of sport. Every Thursday, all 5 gathered at Fairhaven under their father's command. They dined, they drank, they disappeared into the study. No wives, no servants, no witnesses. Only the sound of muffled conversation punctuated by something worse. The occasional, unmistakable scream. In Beaufort society, it was said the Ruddled sons were ambitious men, but among the enslaved, there was another saying whispered in the quarters when night fell. When the judge's lamps burn past midnight, another soul is lost. Among the 200 enslaved people at Fairhaven, only one had the right to step into the judge's study unannounced. His name was Isaac. To most, he was a mystery, a man apart. He spoke little, kept to himself, and carried a quiet dignity that unsettled even those who despised him. While others bent their backs in the fields, Isaac spent his days at a wooden desk in a small, lamplit room adjacent to the study, quill in hand, maintaining the plantation's ledgers. His position was extraordinary, nearly unheard of in the antebellum South. A slave who could read, write, and perform complex arithmetic. His handwriting was immaculate, his mind sharp as a blade. He had not been born to privilege. His mother, Abigail, had been the housekeeper to the judge's father, a woman of quiet brilliance who, somehow, had learned to read when it was punishable by death. Some whispered that a Quaker woman had taught her before the turn of the century. Others said Abigail had simply listened, memorizing letters from the books she dusted. From her, Isaac inherited not only literacy, but a dangerous kind of awareness. As a boy, he'd rise before dawn, a candle stub flickering beside him, learning from a Bible so worn its cover had turned soft from her touch. She'd warned him that knowledge was a blade, powerful but fatal if wielded carelessly. When Abigail died of fever in 1831, Isaac was 19. He might have been sent to the fields, but fate, or perhaps something darker, intervened. While sorting through his mother's few possessions, Isaac had unknowingly revealed his ability to read. The judge had seen it, had seen potential. At first, Isaac expected punishment. Instead, he was given a test. 3 years of ledgers locked in the office with a single command: find the theft. The plantation's white bookkeeper, a man named Henderson, had been embezzling for years. Isaac worked 2 sleepless days, decoding figures, comparing receipts, calculating discrepancies with a precision that stunned his master. When he presented his findings, Henderson was dismissed in disgrace. From that moment on, Isaac became the judge's indispensable servant, his silent accountant, his witness to every transaction, his record keeper. It gave him proximity to power, but it also placed him inside the very heart of evil. The house slaves called him the judge's shadow. The field hands spat when he passed. They thought him proud, complicit, a man who had traded his soul for comfort. But Isaac's silence was not obedience. It was survival. And beneath that silence, something deeper grew, something cold, patient, and resolute. In the ledgers he kept for the judge, he wrote what was demanded. In another, hidden within a hollowed-out Bible, he wrote the truth. He recorded every name, every date, every act. Because Isaac understood what others did not. Paper remembers what people forget. The more Isaac worked inside the judge's house, the more he learned. Knowledge was both his weapon and his curse. By day, he managed ledgers, balanced inventories, and copied correspondence. By night, when the mansion slept, he studied the very documents he was never meant to see. The Rutledge family was careful, but not perfect. Men who believe themselves untouchable grow careless. Sometimes the judge left his desk unlocked after brandy. Sometimes one of his sons forgot to seal a letter. And Isaac, sharp-eyed and unassuming, noticed everything. In those letters, he saw the plantation's hidden economy. Fairhaven was not just a producer of cotton and sugarcane. It was a supplier of bodies. Some were sold, some were rented, and some, those listed only by initials, were sent for study to Charleston under the name of Dr. Thomas Rutledge, the judge's second son. Isaac did not understand the full horror at first, but when he found the term specimens for anatomical instruction, the meaning became clear. Human remains, flesh and bone taken from those who had disappeared. Then came the second discovery, the one that shattered him. Among the papers was a small, folded inventory titled Private Records, Experiment Number 14. Next to the date, in cold, precise handwriting, was a name he knew too well. Abigail, his mother. The notation beside it read simply, "Post-mortem study completed. Findings preserved." Isaac's hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped the page. He wanted to scream, to burn the study to ash, to carve the truth into every wall. But rage, he knew, was a death sentence. So he folded the paper, slid it beneath his sleeve, and returned to his desk with the same calm face he had worn for years. That night, under the faint light of his candle, he wrote her name in his secret ledger. He wrote the date of her death, and beneath it he wrote a single sentence in steady, deliberate ink. They took from her even what death should have spared. It was the first time Isaac allowed hate to live on the page. After that, his education deepened. He began memorizing the judge's routines, the servants' keys, the routes of supply wagons to Charleston. He learned where the ledgers were stored, where the weapons were kept, where the liquor flowed most freely. He never prayed aloud again, but he whispered one vow into the darkness of his quarters each night. "I will make the paper speak." Isaac did not yet know how or when, but the plantation's own records, the same books that justified cruelty, would one day condemn their masters. And for that to happen, he needed more than knowledge. He needed witnesses, he needed proof, and he would soon find both, hidden not in the study, but in the old smokehouse, where the earth itself was beginning to give up its secrets. The old smokehouse sat behind the main quarters, beneath the sprawling oaks that dripped with Spanish moss. Once it had been used to cure meat. By 1848, it was a place no one entered without permission. The enslaved whispered that ghosts lingered there, that at night the smokehouse wept. Isaac never believed in ghosts. But one humid afternoon, while searching for missing invoices, he saw something that drew him toward it. Two of the judge's sons, Robert and James, were dragging a heavy cloth-draped cart toward the smokehouse. It was late, nearly sunset. Isaac paused behind a magnolia tree and watched. They spoke in low voices, laughing quietly in that way only cruel men do. When they rolled the cart inside, one of them cursed, and a dark shape fell briefly into view. It wasn't a sack of meat. It was a leg. They didn't see him. But that image, that pale human leg, fixed itself in Isaac's mind. He waited until nightfall. When the lamps inside the house went dark, he crept from his quarters, barefoot and silent. The air was thick with the smell of iron and smoke. Crickets fell silent as he approached the oak grove. The smokehouse door was latched with a simple hook. He lifted it carefully and stepped inside. The stench hit him first, rot mixed with vinegar, like something preserved too long. Moonlight filtered through the cracks in the roof, revealing wooden tables streaked black. On one of them lay the remains of a man, or what was left of him. The skin on the chest had been peeled back and stitched again. The hands were missing. The eyes were gone. In the corner stood glass jars filled with cloudy liquid, each containing something worse than the last. Fingers, teeth, even a small shriveled heart. Labels marked them in neat handwriting. Specimen 12, specimen 14. And then on the lowest shelf he found it. A jar with a faded tag. A.H. 1831. Isaac stared until his vision blurred. His mother's initials. Something in him broke. He sank to his knees, the cool earth damp beneath him. For a long time he didn't move. The silence of the smokehouse pressed around him like a tomb. Then a sound, faint, rhythmic, from outside. Footsteps. He blew out his candle just as the door creaked open. Through the thin slats of the wall, moonlight revealed the silhouette of Dr. Thomas Rutledge. He stepped inside, humming softly, carrying a lantern and a scalpel case. He moved to the table, set down the light, and began his work, unaware that just a few feet away, Isaac was crouched in the shadows, trembling, watching the man who had desecrated his mother's body. The sound of metal on flesh filled the air. A wet, slow rhythm. Isaac did not move, did not breathe, but that night, something ancient awakened inside him, not rage, not grief, but purpose. The judge's sons believed the smokehouse belonged to them. They were wrong. From that night forward, it belonged to Isaac. Every Thursday evening, as the sun dipped behind the marshlands and the first insects began to hum, Fairhaven transformed. The household staff were ordered to finish their duties early, the field hands locked in their quarters. Only the house servants remained, Isaac among them, as the judge's sons arrived one by one through the magnolia-lined drive. The ritual never changed. At exactly 6 o'clock, a carriage from St. Helena rolled to a stop before the portico, its wheels caked with the red clay of the low country. Out stepped Dr. Thomas Rutledge, carrying a black leather case and wearing his physician's coat despite the summer heat. Behind him came Cornelius Jr., stern and silent, with ledgers under his arm. Then William the lawyer, always smirking as though the whole night were a private joke. The twins, Robert and James, arrived last, smelling of whiskey and arrogance. They brought with them the kind of laughter that made servants flinch. Isaac waited by the foyer as the judge descended the staircase, dressed in black, a silver watch gleaming at his waist. His expression never changed. No greeting, no warmth. Only the cold authority of a man presiding over his own kingdom. Once all 5 sons were gathered, the judge would utter the same phrase every time. "Gentlemen, the work continues." The doors to the study closed. The servants were dismissed, and for hours muffled sounds filtered through the heavy oak, the shuffle of boots, the scrape of furniture, sometimes a dull thud followed by silence. Then came the sound Isaac dreaded most, the dragging of something heavy down the hallway toward the cellar steps. The gatherings lasted deep into the night. When they finally ended, the brothers would emerge pale and sweaty, their clothes smelling faintly of antiseptic and smoke. They'd eat in silence, then ride away under the cover of darkness. Only Isaac remained. His duty was to clean the study afterward, to wipe away the traces of whatever had occurred. He did so with mechanical precision, his face expressionless, his hands steady. But his eyes catalogued everything: the stains on the carpet, the burned edges of parchment, the stray drops of blood that led to the cellar door. It was during one such night, in the spring of 1848, that Isaac made his most important discovery. Beneath the judge's desk, half hidden among discarded papers, he found a folded map. It was a sketch of the property, the house, the fields, the slave quarters, the smokehouse, and something else. A structure he had never seen before, a circle drawn in the marshland, labeled only with 2 words: lower chamber. Isaac stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. The next morning he copied it into his hidden ledger, line for line. Whatever the judge and his sons were doing beneath Fairhaven, it was not confined to the house. Something waited in the marsh, a secret built below the earth, and Isaac was the only one brave, or doomed, enough to find it. The marshlands behind Fairhaven were treacherous, a maze of black water, reeds and sinking soil that swallowed anything heavier than a bird. Even the overseers avoided it, claiming it was cursed ground. Yet, one moonless night, Isaac went there alone. He carried no lantern, only a small knife and the folded map he had copied into his secret ledger. The air was thick with insects, the smell of salt and decay clinging to every breath. His feet sank with each step, the mud sucking at his heels as if the land itself wanted him to turn back. He counted his paces carefully, just as the map had marked. Past the edge of the cypress grove, past the fallen tree that leaned toward the river. Then, there, a patch of ground where the reeds grew shorter, the soil firmer. At first he saw nothing. Then, in the faint glimmer of starlight, he noticed something unnatural, a small mound of stones arranged in a perfect circle. Beneath the stones lay an iron hatch half buried in mud, fitted with a heavy lock. It was real. The lower chamber. Isaac knelt and ran his fingers along the iron. It was cold, solid, recently oiled. He pressed his ear to the metal and heard it, a sound, faint, echoing, like a chain scraping stone. He recoiled, every instinct screaming to flee. But something deeper held him there, the same quiet resolve that had guided him since he'd found his mother's name in the ledgers. He had to know what the judge was hiding. He marked the spot carefully with a broken branch and returned to the house before dawn, mud clinging to his trousers. For the next several days he waited, pretending ignorance, going about his duties as usual. Then Thursday came. That night, as the judge and his sons gathered again, Isaac kept count. The carriages had arrived as always. The doors had closed. The same muffled voices echoed through the study. But this time the sounds lasted longer, far longer. Near midnight, he heard the same dragging noises again, only this time leading out of the house toward the back fields. He followed at a distance, staying within the shadows of the oaks. 5 figures moved ahead, 6 if he counted the limp shape they carried between them. They crossed into the marsh. One by one, the lanterns disappeared into the darkness, their glow sinking below ground level. The lower chamber was open. Isaac waited until the last light vanished, then crept closer. He reached the clearing, crouched behind the reeds, and saw the iron hatch standing wide, faint light glowing from below. He peered inside. A staircase of stone descended into the earth, lined with wooden torches that crackled faintly. And from somewhere below came a low, rhythmic chant, the voices of men repeating something in unison. Isaac's breath caught. He couldn't make out the words. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary meeting. Fair Haven was not just a plantation. It was a shrine to something the judge and his sons had built with human suffering. Isaac turned and fled silently through the marsh, his mind already set on one thing. If he could not destroy Fair Haven from the outside, he would burn it from within. In the days following his discovery of the lower chamber, Isaac moved like a man living 2 lives. By daylight, he was the obedient clerk, silent, efficient, unremarkable. But by night, when the house fell still, he wrote. The secret Bible beneath his cot had grown thick with pages, each one filled with a different kind of testimony, not prayer, but record. He called it quietly to himself, the Ledger of the Dead. It began as a list of names, the enslaved men and women who had vanished from the plantation over the years. At first, no one questioned their disappearances. Some were said to have run off, others that they'd died of fever. But Isaac had seen the truth written in the ledgers, small notations in the margins. Specimen sent, delivered to Dr. T.R., no return. He cross-referenced every name, every shipment, every Thursday night that coincided with a new absence. Slowly, the pattern emerged. In 8 years, 43 people had gone missing, each Thursday gathering aligned with one disappearance. But there was more. From scraps of paper, half-burned notes, and medical invoices, Isaac pieced together the extent of the horror. The Rutledges had been conducting experiments, crude dissections under the guise of scientific study. Dr. Thomas sought to prove that Negro physiology was inherently inferior, that suffering could be quantified, that obedience had a physical root in the brain. The judge funded it. Cornelius Jr. documented it. William filed the legal protections. And the twins provided the victims. It was a family enterprise, a private theology built on cruelty. The more Isaac read, the deeper his fury burned. He wrote their crimes in precise detail, careful and deliberate, as though each word were a nail in their coffin. He described every experiment he could confirm, every victim he could name. He wrote in the same tone the judge used in court, calm, factual, undeniable. Because Isaac understood something vital. The Rutledges could deny rumor, but not record. The same obsession with documentation that had built their empire would destroy it. He even forged the judge's handwriting to create copies of incriminating orders, directives that, when found, would implicate the family beyond defense. It was dangerous work. One wrong move, one misplaced sheet, and he would vanish like the rest. Still, he continued. And then, late one night in July, something changed. While reviewing the judge's correspondence, Isaac found a letter sealed in red wax, addressed not to Charleston or Savannah, but to Washington. D.C., it was a petition, a proposal for a Southern Medical Institute to be founded at Fairhaven, where the physiology of servitude would be studied for the advancement of science and civilization. The letter was signed, not by the judge alone, but by a dozen other plantation owners from across the South. The Rutledges were not acting alone. They were part of something far larger. Isaac read the final line of the letter and felt the room spin. Upon the next full moon, our first public demonstration will commence. The date was August 17th, 1848, 3 weeks away. Isaac set down the letter, staring into the candle flame. The time for writing had ended. The time for reckoning had begun. The August air in Beaufort was heavy with salt and heat, the kind that clung to the skin and refused to lift even after midnight. Cicadas screamed in the pines. The tide in the May River crept up through the reeds, lapping against the roots of the oaks that framed the Fairhaven estate like sentinels. Inside the main house, preparations had been underway for days. Carriages arrived bearing gentlemen from Charleston, Savannah, even Richmond, men of letters, physicians, judges, investors. They came dressed for civility, linen coats and polished boots, yet spoke with the zeal of men hungry for spectacle. Judge Cornelius Rutledge moved among them with a quiet pride. To these men he was not merely a landowner but a pioneer. He had promised them proof, scientific proof, that the enslaved were a distinct order of creation, beings whose pain and emotion differed from their masters. His private experiments, he told them, were ready for unveiling. No one questioned the source of the specimens. No one asked what had become of the women and men who had passed through Fairhaven's cellar. Isaac watched all of it. From the kitchen yard he saw the lanterns glowing in the windows, the silhouettes of men raising glasses, the laughter that floated out into the swamp-thick night. Each sound carved another line into his resolve. For weeks he had prepared. The copies of his ledger were hidden in 3 places: the hollow of an oak near the slave quarters, the false bottom of a barrel bound for Charleston, and beneath a loose brick in the courthouse basement where he sometimes delivered plantation records. Whatever happened tonight, the evidence would survive. At dusk he visited the study for what appeared to be routine bookkeeping. In truth, he added one final measure to his plan. A vial of laudanum poured into the decanter reserved for the Rutledge men, just as he had tested months earlier. Then, in the stillness of the kitchen house, he opened his canvas bag, razor honed to a mirror edge, clean cloths, a small bottle of carbolic acid. By 10 o'clock the demonstration had begun. The guests descended the narrow stairs into the cellar, their conversation hushed but excited. A table had been prepared, white sheets laid across its surface, brass instruments gleaming in lamplight. Bound to that table was a young woman no older than 16, her wrists strapped, her eyes wide with terror. Thomas Rutledge, in his physician's coat, addressed the gathering. He spoke of anatomy, of enlightenment, of the moral necessity of study. His words rolled through the stone chamber like sermon and sentence combined. Isaac stood at the top of the stairs, unseen in the shadow. His hands trembled, not with fear, but focus. He waited until the laudanum began to dull their movements, until voices slurred, until the judge's command for more light came out thick and uncertain. Then he blew out his own lamp. Darkness swallowed the hall. From below came a shout, then confusion, and the first sharp scream. By morning, the Fairhaven house would be nothing but smoke and rumor. But that night, the night of August 17th, 1848, Isaac stepped into legend. When the first tongues of flame touched the eaves of Fairhaven, The night was already heavy with screams. What began as a controlled blaze in the lower cellar had grown quickly, fed by spirits and pitch, crawling up the wooden stairwell like a living thing. The guests, disoriented by the laudanum, stumbled through smoke-filled corridors, choking, shouting for servants who had long since fled into the fields. Some tried to reach the main door, but the entryway had been barred from the outside. Windows shattered under fists and pistol butts, but the fire moved faster than desperation. Isaac moved among them like a shadow. His hands, steady as ever, worked with a surgeon's calm. He did not scream or curse. He simply did what had to be done. He found the judge first, half-conscious, crawling toward the study. Cornelius Rutledge's once commanding face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with disbelief as he saw the man who had stood beside him for 20 years now standing over him, with a razor glinting in lamplight. "Isaac," he gasped, his voice breaking. What have you done?" Isaac didn't answer. The blade flashed once, clean and quick. The old man's words ended in a wet choke. He moved next to the twins, Robert and James, found them slumped against the parlor wall, too drugged to stand. When they saw him, one tried to laugh, thinking it was some nightmare born of the laudanum haze. He realized too late it was real. Downstairs the cellar roared like a furnace. The air shimmered with heat. Isaac stepped through the thickening smoke, finding Thomas and William slumped near the table where their victim still lay. He freed her hands, wrapped her in a cloth, and whispered for her to run, to follow the river and not look back. Then he turned back toward the fire. No one knows exactly how long he stayed in that burning house. Witnesses later said they saw him standing in a window frame, illuminated against the flames, motionless, watching as the roof caved in. Others swore they heard his voice, low and calm, reciting scripture over the roar of fire, something about the wages of sin. By dawn, Fairhaven was ash. Of the 20 men gathered that night, only 3 survived long enough to crawl to the yard. None could speak clearly of what they had seen. Their tongues were swollen, their minds half lost to smoke and shock. They repeated only one word when found by the search party from Beaufort: Isaac. The newspapers, days later, called it the Fairhaven tragedy. They wrote of a house fire, of accidental deaths, of a freak explosion in the cellar. The medical examiner's report vanished before it could be filed. Within weeks, the ruins were cleared. A new house began to rise on the ashes, built by other hands, under another name. The Rutledge family line, it was said, had ended in misfortune. And of Isaac, there was no trace. Only the ledger remained. In the weeks that followed the Fairhaven fire, Beaufort became a town that refused to speak above a whisper. The ashes of the great house still smoked when the first patrols were sent out. White men on horseback, rifles across their saddles, bloodhounds straining against their leashes. They searched the marshes, the riverbanks, the ruins. They found no body. The official story, printed in the Charleston Mercury, declared that a deranged Negro servant, known to possess rudimentary education, had turned on his masters and perished in the conflagration. But privately, no one in Beaufort believed Isaac was dead. He had been too methodical, too patient. The fire had not been madness. It had been judgment. Old men swore they saw him days later, moving through the cypress swamps like a ghost, barefoot, silent, his clothes blackened with soot. A fisherman claimed he found a small wooden chest hidden in the reeds near the May River, containing scraps of paper covered in strange writing and numbers. The sheriff took the papers, and they were never seen again. The patrols widened their search, reaching as far as the Savannah River. Slave catchers were offered a bounty, $200 for Isaac, dead or alive. None collected it. What they did find, months later, 30 miles inland, was a Bible washed up along the riverbank. Its pages were scorched but intact. Hidden within its hollowed center was a small leather-bound book, the same that would resurface decades later in the Beaufort courthouse basement. The journal was written in Isaac's precise, looping script. The first pages contained lists of names, ledgers of numbers, but toward the end his tone shifted. The records became confession, reflection, prophecy. "If justice will not come from the law of men," he wrote, "then it must come from the hand of the enslaved. I have seen the measure of their mercy, and it is none. Let the fire carry truth where my voice cannot." There were no final entries. No signature. Just a single Latin phrase scrawled across the last page. One Isaac had likely learned from the judge's own library. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Let justice be done, though the heavens fall. After that, he vanished from record, but not from memory. Among the enslaved communities of the Sea Islands, songs began to circulate. Low, mournful hymns that spoke of the man who burned the wicked house. To the masters, it was a warning. To the enslaved, it was a kind of gospel. Children born years later would hear the tale whispered by their mothers. He wrote their names in a book of fire, and God himself read it. Isaac became both ghost and symbol, a man erased from history, yet present in every silence that followed. Because what burned that night was not only a house, it was the illusion that evil done in the dark could stay buried forever. In the autumn of 1954, during a restoration project on the old Beaufort courthouse, a workman prying up a warped floorboard in the records room found a small leather-bound book wedged between the joists. It was wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with brittle wax, and marked with a faded insignia, the outline of a cypress tree burned into the cover. The foreman turned it over to the county clerk, who in turn passed it to the archivist, a quiet man named Harold Pritchard. Within days, Pritchard realized what he had in his hands wasn't an ordinary record ledger. The handwriting was exquisite, too precise, too deliberate. The language shifted between plantation inventories and strange, almost philosophical passages about morality, freedom, and fire. The last page made him shiver. The Latin phrase was written in heavy ink as though carved into the paper. Fiat justitia ruat caelum. Pritchard brought the book home that night. He couldn't sleep. He read until dawn, his wife waking to find him pale, shaking, muttering that it reads like a confession. Over the next few weeks, he began cross-referencing the names listed in the early pages with local burial records. Every one of them, Cornelius Rutledge, the twins Robert and James, Thomas and William, had perished in the Fairhaven fire of 1852. The cause of death, officially, accidental conflagration. But the handwriting in the journal was dated 2 days after the fire. That detail changed everything. Pritchard tried to alert the County Historical Society. But when he arrived at the courthouse to deliver the ledger, he found the records room sealed off. The restoration company had been ordered to stop work. No explanation given. 2 days later, Pritchard was found dead in his car, parked beside the May River. The coroner ruled it a heart attack. The journal was missing. For decades afterward, the story of the Beaufort Ledger circulated quietly among collectors, archivists, and historians of the South. Some said it had been taken by a private family whose name still carried weight in Charleston society. Others swore it had been sold on the black market, smuggled through Savannah, eventually disappearing somewhere in New Orleans. Then in 1997, a copy surfaced. A photostat of a single page was mailed anonymously to a professor of American history at Tulane University. It contained Isaac's handwriting and a line never before recorded. History is only the mask of truth. Burn the mask, and the face beneath will terrify you. The professor brought it to the press. Within weeks, the story went national, the lost journal of a slave who burned his masters. But before any full publication could happen, the university archives were broken into. The page was gone. Only one photograph of it remains, grainy, blurred, but unmistakable. In the lower corner of the page, faintly visible beneath Isaac's handwriting, is the impression of a thumbprint. No one has ever been able to say whose it was. In the summer of 2021, a graduate student named Clara Jennings was cataloging forgotten estate papers in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Louisiana Historical Society. She was working late when she came across an unlabeled box sealed with red wax. Inside were brittle maps, river deeds, and at the very bottom, a leather volume the color of dried blood. Its cover was stamped with a faint, burned-in symbol, a cypress tree. Clara recognized it instantly. She had read the Tulane article years earlier, the story of the Beaufort Ledger, and thought it a myth. But as she opened the book, her hands trembling, she realized what she held was no copy. It was the original. The first half matched the known transcriptions, plantation inventories, debts, crop tallies. But as she turned the pages, the handwriting shifted, becoming urgent, fevered. The ink grew darker, the sentences stranger, as if Isaac had written by firelight, racing time itself. On the final page, beneath the Latin inscription, there was something new. A smaller note, faint and almost hidden in the binding. It read, "If this reaches hands that do not tremble, then know, I did not die in the fire. The river carried me south. I lived as another name, but never as another man." Below it, a date, June 1853, nearly a year after the fire. Clara sat frozen. For a moment she thought she heard water somewhere in the room, a slow dripping sound, rhythmic, deliberate. When she looked up, the ceiling vent was dry. The sound stopped. She reported the find, and within days, the Louisiana Historical Society became a war zone of journalists, curators, and lawyers. The Ruddle descendants tried to block publication, claiming the ledger was forged, to defame an honorable family, but carbon dating proved the paper and ink were authentic to the 1850s. The truth could no longer be buried. When the book was finally displayed under glass, visitors stood in silence before it, some weeping, others unable to look away. The handwriting was small and steady, every letter a wound reopened. Scholars now call it one of the most important documents of the antebellum South, not because of what it records, but because of who recorded it. A man born enslaved, educated in secret, who wrote his master's crimes in their own language and sealed it in fire. But there is one last mystery. Infrared imaging revealed that beneath Isaac's inked words, faint indentations cover the final page, the ghost of another message, pressed into the paper but never inked. Digital restoration has recovered only fragments. Beneath the cypress, where the river bends, the second ledger remains. As of today, that second book has never been found. Somewhere along the Mississippi Delta, the story of Isaac, the man who turned history against itself, is still waiting to be unearthed. And when it is, the heavens may fall once more. History is written by those who survive, but sometimes, the ones who were never meant to speak leave behind the loudest echoes. Isaac's name does not appear in the census, not in the plantation logs, not in any church burial. Yet his handwriting, steady, defiant, human, survived the fire meant to erase him. The Beaufort Ledger stands as both confession and condemnation, proof that even in a world built on silence, one man dared to record the truth. And maybe, somewhere beneath the cypress trees, that second ledger still lies waiting for the day the earth itself will decide that enough has been hidden.